Dr. Malcolm Reid, a distinguished black cardiac surgeon, battles systemic racism and covert corruption while striving to establish a free health clinic in a prejudiced community. Despite his wealth and influence, Malcolm faces relentless bias and discrimination from law enforcement officers like Burke and Daniels, alongside manipulative antagonists such as his former partner Marcus Chen, who aim to tarnish his reputation and derail his mission. Subtle microaggressions and overt acts of prejudice intensify the conflict, pushing Malcolm to confront deeply ingrained societal biases. Supported by a loyal team, he remains resolute in his fight against injustice and inequality. Dr. Malcolm Reid adjusted his tie in the reflection of the diner's smudged glass window, his polished shoes clicking against the cracked pavement. The scent of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee wafted through the slightly propped open door, blending with the faint hum of a neon, open 24 hours sign inside. The chatter of early risers mixed with the occasional clatter of plates. A comforting chaos Malcolm welcomed on mornings like this. He stepped inside, ducking slightly to avoid the dangling ceiling fan, which lazily stirred the warm air. Heads turned briefly in his direction, some nodding in recognition, others barely glancing at the tall, broad-shouldered man in his tailored overcoat. For most patrons, he was just another face, a well-dressed stranger stopping by for breakfast before another long day. For Malcolm, the anonymity was both a relief and a reminder of the unseen lines that still defined his world. Sliding into a booth near the back, Malcolm set his briefcase on the seat beside him. The smell of the diner reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen, where he'd spent countless Sundays as a child, elbows on the table, listening to her stories about resilience and quiet strength. He ran his fingers across the laminated menu, its edges frayed from years of use. The waitress, a woman with kind eyes and a sharp wit, approached with a notepad in hand. "Morning. Sugar coffee to start?" she asked, her southern drawl warm and familiar. "Yes, ma'am, black, please," Malcolm replied, offering a smile. "Coming right up." As she disappeared into the kitchen, Malcolm glanced at his phone. The emails had already started pouring in, requests for meetings, updates on the new mentorship program he'd funded, and another invitation to speak at a university about the intersection of wealth, race, and power. His public life, often a whirlwind of boardrooms and speaking engagements, was a stark contrast to the life he preferred to lead, a quiet, modest one, where his title as one of the country's most respected cardiac surgeons mattered little. Malcolm's humility was deliberate, shaped by years of navigating spaces where his achievements were often questioned. He could still recall the days of medical school, when professors doubted his abilities, or the hospital boardroom meetings where his suggestions were met with patronizing nods, until they proved too effective to ignore. Success, he'd learned, was a double-edged sword for a black man in his position. It afforded him influence, but it never shielded him from the weight of prejudice. The bell above the diner's door jingled as another customer entered, a middle-aged white man in a stained flannel shirt. His boots tracked mud across the worn linoleum floor, leaving a trail to the counter where he ordered in a booming voice. He glanced in Malcolm's direction, his gaze lingering a fraction too long, before turning back to his coffee. Malcolm shifted in his seat, his calm exterior betraying none of the unease he felt. These moments were subtle but unmistakable, a look, a pause, a question unspoken yet loud in its implication. He'd encountered them all his life, from quiet rural towns to gleaming urban skyscrapers. This wasn't anger or hostility, just a quiet reminder of his place in a world still grappling with its own biases. The waitress returned, setting a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. "You know what you'd like, sugar?" "I'll take the eggs, scrambled, with a side of toast," Malcolm replied. She scribbled his order down, her pen moving in quick, efficient strokes. "You got it." As he waited, Malcolm opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. The top sheet was a proposal for a free health clinic in a struggling part of town, a project close to his heart. His career had afforded him wealth and prestige, but it was projects like this that gave his work meaning. He'd spent months fighting to get it approved, navigating layers of red tape and skeptical investors. To some, his insistence on opening the clinic was a noble but unnecessary venture. To Malcolm, it was non-negotiable. His thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the counter. The man in flannel had raised his voice, gesturing angrily at the waitress. "I said extra crispy, what's so hard about that?" The waitress, unfazed, crossed her arms. "I'll get you another plate, but there's no need to yell." "I'm not paying for this mistake," the man snapped, his face reddening. Malcolm watched the exchange quietly, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of the table. The tension in the room thickened, conversations at nearby tables fading into murmurs. The waitress glanced in Malcolm's direction, her expression briefly softening, before she turned back to the irate customer. "Look, mister, I don't make the rules. You want a new plate? You'll have to pay for it," she said firmly. The man slammed his hand on the counter, causing the silverware to rattle. "This is ridiculous. You people are always looking to make a buck off decent folks." Malcolm's jaw tightened, his instinct to intervene warring with his desire to avoid unnecessary attention. He'd spent years learning to choose his battles, but something about the man's tone, the way his words dripped with unspoken prejudice, grated against his carefully maintained composure. The waitress stepped back, her confidence faltering. Malcolm rose from his seat, his movements deliberate and calm, and approached the counter. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The man turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" "Just someone who thinks there's a better way to handle this," Malcolm replied evenly. The man sized him up, his gaze flicking briefly to the briefcase in Malcolm's hand and the polished shoes on his feet. "You some kind of lawyer or something?" "Something like that," Malcolm said with a faint smile. "Now, why don't we all take a breath and let the lady do her job?" The man scoffed, muttering something under his breath, but he relented, retreating to his seat with a dismissive wave. The waitress exhaled slowly, offering Malcolm a grateful nod. "Thank you," she said quietly. Malcolm returned to his booth, his coffee now lukewarm, but still comforting in its familiarity. Moments like these reminded him of the fragility of civility, the thin veneer that could crack so easily under the weight of ignorance or frustration. He'd faced worse, of course, but every encounter left a mark, however small. As he returned to his folder, the waitress approached again, this time with a slice of pie on a separate plate. "On the house," she said, sliding it in front of him. "For sticking up for me." Malcolm chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's not necessary." "Maybe not, but it's appreciated," she replied, her smile warm and genuine. He nodded, taking a small bite of the pie. Outside, the morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement, hinting at the day ahead. For Malcolm, it was just another morning, another reminder of the tightrope he walked, a balance between power and prejudice, humility and pride. But as he finished his coffee, the faintest trace of a smile crossed his lips. Today, like every day, he would face it head-on, his purpose unshaken. Malcolm had barely finished the last bite of his pie when the door to the diner swung open with force, the bell above it ringing loudly as if in protest. Two police officers stepped inside, their uniforms crisp and black, hands resting casually on their belts. The hum of conversation in the diner faltered, one of those small-town silences that settled in when things felt off. Malcolm instinctively stiffened, but didn't let it show. He folded his hands neatly on the table, keeping his expression composed as the officers scanned the room, their gazes lingering briefly on him. One of them, a tall man with a hard jaw and a shaved head, leaned toward the waitress at the counter. "We got a call about some trouble here," the officer said, his voice carrying through the room like gravel dragging across pavement. The waitress's eyes darted to Malcolm, hesitation flickering across her face. "It's all good, officers. Just a misunderstanding earlier. Everything's been handled." The other officer, stockier with a perpetual scowl etched into his face, narrowed his eyes as he glanced toward Malcolm. "We'll be the judge of that, ma'am. Who was involved?" The waitress shifted uncomfortably, wiping her hands on her apron. "The gentleman over there just stepped in to calm things down. That's all it was." She motioned toward Malcolm with a faint smile. "He was helping." Both officers turned in unison, their stares landing on Malcolm as though they were sizing him up for something he hadn't done. The taller officer took a step forward, his boots creaking against the worn floor. Malcolm felt their gazes like heat on the back of his neck, but he didn't move, didn't flinch. He'd seen this before. He knew the script. "You mind stepping outside for a moment, sir?" the taller officer asked, his tone polite, but carrying an edge Malcolm recognized all too well. Malcolm's brow furrowed faintly. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" The officer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just need to ask you a few questions, standard protocol." "I'm sure it is," Malcolm replied smoothly, his voice even and calm, though something sharp burned beneath the surface. He reached for his briefcase and coat, rising from the booth with deliberate slowness. "Let's step outside then." The diner fell deathly quiet as Malcolm walked past the other tables. Some patrons looked away, pretending not to notice, while others watched openly with uneasy curiosity. The man in the flannel shirt smirked into his coffee mug, his eyes flickering toward Malcolm as though silently claiming victory. Outside, the chill of the morning air nipped at Malcolm's face, the parking lot half empty and slick from a light drizzle earlier. The officers followed him, one on either side, like bookends closing in. "Sir, can I see some identification?" the stockier officer demanded. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, though his hand reached into his wallet without hesitation. "Is there a particular reason why, officer?" He glanced at the officer's name tag. "Thompson?" "Like I said, standard protocol," Officer Thompson replied curtly, snatching the ID from Malcolm's outstretched hand. He looked down at it, his brows knitting slightly as he read the name. "Dr. Malcolm Reid?" The word doctor sounded almost mocking on his lips. "Yes," Malcolm said, his patience wearing thin. "Dr. Malcolm Reid. Is there a problem?" The tall officer, whose name tag read Burke, stepped closer, his posture relaxed but intimidating. "The diner staff says you intervened in an altercation. Why don't you tell us what happened?" Malcolm exhaled slowly, refusing to let his frustration seep into his voice. "There was no altercation, Officer Burke. A man at the counter was being disrespectful to the waitress. I simply asked him to calm down, and that was the end of it. You can ask her." Officer Thompson's lips pulled into a skeptical smirk. "You asked him, huh? Sounds like you might have escalated things." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his words remained measured. "Escalated, I spoke calmly and respectfully. That's all." Burke leaned closer, his expression unreadable. "Where you from, Doc? You don't look like you belong around here." The question hung in the air like smoke. Malcolm knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't about where he was from. It was about where they thought he didn't belong. "I'm here on business," Malcolm replied tersely, meeting Burke's stare head-on. "Now, unless you have any evidence of wrongdoing, I'd like my ID back. I'm sure you have more pressing matters than harassing a paying customer." Thompson's expression darkened, and for a moment, Malcolm wondered if he'd gone too far. He felt his pulse quicken, an instinctive response, a reminder that standing up for himself always carried a risk. "Watch your tone," Thompson said, stepping forward, his finger jabbing the air near Malcolm's chest. "We're doing our job, and you'd do well to remember that." Malcolm didn't move, though he could feel his hands tightening into fists at his sides. He forced himself to exhale, focusing on the stillness he'd mastered over years of practicing surgery. Steady hands, steady mind. "I'm not questioning your job, officers, I'm simply asking you to respect my rights." Before either officer could respond, the diner door opened, and the waitress stepped outside, her face flushed with worry. "Officers, this really isn't necessary. Dr. Reid didn't do anything wrong." The officers turned to her, visibly annoyed. "Ma'am," Burke said sharply, "we're handling it." "Handling what?" she shot back, her voice rising with frustration. "A man stepped in to keep me from being harassed, and now you're interrogating him like he's the problem?" Burke's jaw tightened, but he handed Malcolm's ID back. "You're free to go, Dr. Reid. Just watch yourself next time." The words stung more than Malcolm cared to admit. Watch yourself, a veiled warning, a reminder of his place. Malcolm accepted his ID with a curt nod. "You gentlemen have a good day." The officers muttered something between themselves as they turned away, their boots crunching against the gravel as they retreated to their patrol car. The waitress approached Malcolm, her voice soft with apology. "I'm so sorry about that. They had no right." "It's not your fault," Malcolm said gently, slipping his wallet back into his coat pocket. He glanced toward the patrol car, where the officers sat talking, their gazes occasionally flicking toward him. "But it's a familiar story." Her face fell, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of wind rustling through the nearby trees. People here aren't used to seeing someone like you, dress sharp, minding your business. Malcolm gave her a small, weary smile. That's the problem, isn't it? The waitress nodded, ashamed on behalf of a town she'd likely called home all her life. If you ever come back, your coffee's on me. Thank you, Malcolm replied, his voice soft. But I think I've overstayed my welcome. He returned to his car, his mind racing as he placed the briefcase in the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. The adrenaline was finally beginning to fade, leaving only exhaustion in its place. Moments like these always chipped at him, no matter how many times they happened. The worst part wasn't the officer's suspicion, or even their barely veiled disdain. It was the realization that no matter how accomplished he became, no matter how carefully he presented himself, some people would always see him as a threat first and a man second. Malcolm sat in the car for a long moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel as he stared at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. Calm, controlled, respectable. He repeated the words in his head like a mantra, a lifeline to cling to in a world that tested his patience daily. His phone buzzed beside him, pulling him back to the present. It was a message from his assistant. Board meeting confirmed for tomorrow. Investors are concerned. Be prepared to explain the clinic proposal again. Malcolm sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew what concerned meant. It was code for uncomfortable. Too much money, they'd say, to build a free health clinic in a struggling community. A waste of resources, a bad investment. His qualifications as a surgeon wouldn't matter in that room, just like they hadn't mattered in the diner parking lot. But Malcolm wasn't the kind of man who backed down. He started the engine, the low hum filling the silence. If they wanted to question his decisions, he'd face them the same way he always did, with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth, even if the world refused to see it. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the heavy weight that pressed down on Dr. Malcolm Reid. The sky was a blanket of steel clouds, threatening rain. As Malcolm navigated the sleek corridors of the Cedar Grove Community Hospital, his steps echoed softly against the polished floors, each stride purposeful, yet burdened with the residual tension from the previous day's confrontation at the diner. As he approached his office, the door swung open to reveal Dr. Lisa Mitchell, his longtime colleague and friend. Her expression was a mix of concern and determination, a silent testament to the unspoken struggles they both faced within the institution. "Malcolm, we need to talk," Lisa said, her voice low but urgent. Malcolm paused, sensing the gravity in her tone. He motioned for her to enter, closing the door behind her. The office, usually a sanctuary of order and control, felt stifling today. "What's going on, Lisa?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, his eyes searching hers for answers. Lisa took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly together on her desk. "It's the board. They're pushing back hard on the free health clinic proposal. Some members are saying it's too risky, too much of a financial burden. They're questioning your judgment, Malcolm." Malcolm felt a pang of frustration tighten in his chest. He had poured his heart into the clinic, believing it was a necessary step towards addressing the systemic healthcare disparities plaguing underserved communities. "I've already addressed their concerns in the last meeting. They just don't see the long-term benefits." Lisa shook her head slowly. "It's not just the board. There are whispers outside the hospital too. Some patients and even some staff are starting to doubt your intentions. They see your success and assume you're out of touch with their struggles." Malcolm clenched his fists, the internal conflict brewing beneath his calm exterior. "I've always been here for them, Lisa. I've dedicated my career to saving lives, not just those who can afford it." She nodded sympathetically. "I know. But appearances matter, especially in this climate. The incident at the diner didn't help either. You've become a target, Malcolm." Before Malcolm could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, his heart sinking as he read the words. "Meet me at the courthouse. It's urgent. Officer Burke." His mind raced. Burke was one of the officers from the diner incident, the one who had questioned him about his motives. Malcolm had hoped to put that encounter behind him. But it seemed unresolved tensions were far from over. "Lisa, I have to go," he said, standing up. Something just came up. She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Be careful, Malcolm. Don't let them intimidate you. He offered a tight smile, trying to mask his anxiety. I won't. I just need to get some clarity on what's happening. As he left his office, the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital's corridors seemed to close in around him. The courthouse loomed in the distance, its grand pillars a stark contrast to the turmoil he felt inside Malcolm's car ride, was filled with a silent determination. He had built his career on resilience and integrity. He wouldn't let unfounded accusations derail his mission. Upon arriving at the courthouse, the imposing facade of the building was already swarming with police activity. Uniformed officers moved with purpose, and the hum of reporters' voices filled the air, amplifying the sense of urgency. Malcolm parked his car a safe distance away, taking a moment to steady his nerves before approaching the entrance. Inside, the courthouse was a whirlwind of activity. People hurried through the halls, some seeking justice, others looking for answers. Malcolm navigated through the crowd, his mind focused on the meeting ahead. As he reached the main courtroom, he spotted Officer Burke standing by the doors, his expression unreadable. Dr. Reid, Burke greeted him, a hint of recognition in his voice. Thank you for coming. Malcolm nodded, taking a seat at the back of the courtroom. He glanced around, noticing the skeptical gazes from various attendees, colleagues, community members, and a few journalists with cameras poised to capture every moment. The judge entered, signaling the start of proceedings. Please be seated. We are here today to address the allegations made against Dr. Malcolm Reid concerning the incident at the diner on Tuesday morning. Malcolm's heart pounded, but he maintained his composure. He knew the importance of staying calm under scrutiny. The prosecutor approached the bench, her demeanor stern and unyielding. Your Honor, the prosecution has evidence suggesting that Dr. Reid not only intervened unnecessarily, but also escalated the situation at the diner, leading to public disturbance and potential harassment. Malcolm felt the weight of the room's attention pressing down on him. He had expected some pushback, but the aggressive tone of the prosecution was unsettling. He listened as they presented testimonies from the diner's patrons, painting a picture of a man who couldn't control his temper despite his esteemed position. When it was his turn, Malcolm stood, offering a respectful nod to the judge before addressing the courtroom. Your Honor, I understand the concerns raised by the prosecution. However, my actions that morning were driven solely by a desire to maintain peace and protect the waitress from unwarranted aggression. I believe there has been a misunderstanding of my intentions. He took a deep breath, meeting the eyes of those who doubted him. As a physician, my duty is to heal and to help, not to escalate conflicts. I intervened to de-escalate a situation that could have turned violent. My motivations were purely to ensure the safety and well-being of those involved. The prosecutor countered, presenting evidence that seemed to contradict his account. Surveillance footage, snippets of overheard conversations, and biased interpretations of his demeanor were used to undermine his credibility. Malcolm felt his resolve waver, but clung to the core of his integrity. As the proceedings continued, the tension in the courtroom mounted. The testimonies were conflicting, with some supporting his version of events, while others painted him in a less favorable light. The judge listened intently, occasionally interjecting to clarify points or question the reliability of certain testimonies. Outside the courtroom, Lisa sat in a waiting area, her expression a mixture of worry and support. She had been in constant contact with Malcolm, offering words of encouragement and reminding him of the impact of his work. Stay strong, Malcolm. You know who you are and what you stand for. Malcolm appreciated her support, but couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness creeping in. The systemic biases he had faced for years were now converging in this one moment, challenging not only his professional standing, but his personal dignity as well. As the day wore on, the courtroom drama reached its peak. The judge prepared to make a ruling. The room hushed in anticipation. Malcolm stood once more, his heart racing, but his spirit unbroken. Based on the evidence presented, the judge began, her voice steady. It is clear that while there were moments of tension, Dr. Malcolm Reid acted within his rights and responsibilities. Therefore, the charges are hereby dismissed. A collective sigh of relief echoed through the courtroom. Malcolm allowed himself a brief moment to relax, the tension easing from his shoulders. He offered a polite nod to the prosecutor before returning to his seat. However, as he made his way out of the courtroom, a group of protesters had gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Justice for All" and "End Systemic Racism." Their presence was a stark reminder that the battle against prejudice was far from over. Back at his car, Malcolm's phone buzzed again with messages from concerned colleagues and supporters. He took a moment to respond, acknowledging their support with brief but heartfelt messages. Yet, the sense of unfinished business lingered. That evening, Malcolm attended a community meeting he had organized to discuss healthcare disparities and the role of free clinics in underserved areas. The room was filled with passionate individuals eager to share their experiences and advocate for change. As he stood at the podium, his presence commanding yet humble, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady. "Today, we are here to bridge the gaps in our healthcare system and ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, has access to the care they deserve." The audience responded with nods and applause, their energy fueling his determination. As he spoke about the clinic's mission and the steps needed to make it a reality, he felt the support of the community surrounding him. Yet, amidst the positive energy, there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that not everyone was on board with his vision. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed, Malcolm found himself face to face with Officer Burke once more. The man's demeanor was colder this time, his eyes devoid of the initial curiosity. "Dr. Reid," Burke said, his tone clipped. "We need to talk." Malcolm's heart sank, but he maintained his composure. "What is it now, officer?" Burke glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. "We've received new information regarding your clinic proposal. There are questions about the funding sources and potential conflicts of interest." Malcolm felt a surge of frustration, but kept his voice calm. "I assure you, everything is transparent and above board. The funding comes from legitimate grants and donations from community members who support our mission." Burke's eyes narrowed. "We're looking into possible ties with certain organizations that might have hidden agendas. Until we have clarity, we need to conduct a more thorough investigation." Malcolm took a deep breath, the weight of yet another obstacle pressing down on him. "I understand the need for due diligence. Please let me know if there's any additional information you require." Burke nodded curtly. "We'll be in touch." As Burke walked away, Malcolm felt the familiar sting of systemic bias, the invisible lines that continued to define and confine him despite his status and success. He glanced around the now empty meeting room, the echoes of hopeful conversations lingering in the air. This wasn't just about him or his clinic, it was about the broader fight against entrenched prejudices that sought to undermine progress and equality. Returning to his car, Malcolm dialed Lisa's number. She answered almost immediately, her voice filled with concern. "How did it go?" He exhaled slowly. "Dismissed the charges, but now they're questioning the clinic's funding. It's like they can't let this go." Lisa's voice was steady, offering support. "You've got this, Malcolm. Keep your documentation in order and stay transparent. Don't let them intimidate you." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I will. Thank you, Lisa. I really need your help with the next steps." As they discussed strategies to counter the new accusations, Malcolm felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. He had allies who believed in his mission and supported his integrity. But the battle was far from over, and the mounting pressures threatened to overwhelm him. That night, as he lay in bed, Malcolm's mind replayed the day's events. The courtroom victory, the protest outside, the community meeting, and now the fresh wave of accusations. He felt the walls he'd built around himself beginning to crumble, but a part of him resisted the growing frustration and helplessness. He turned to look out the window, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. The rain had finally begun, tapping rhythmically against the glass. In the midst of his turmoil, Malcolm found solace in the steady sound, a reminder of the resilience he'd cultivated over the years. But beneath the surface, the storm was only intensifying. As the clock ticked past midnight, Malcolm received a call from his legal team. "We need to meet immediately," his lawyer said, urgency in her voice. "There's been a leak. Sensitive information about your clinic proposal has gone public. It's turning the tide against you." Malcolm felt his heart race, the pieces of the puzzle slipping further out of his control. Where, when? Right now, she replied. We need you here at the office. Without hesitation, Malcolm grabbed his coat and briefcase, the internal struggle between anger and maintaining his composure boiling beneath the surface. He knew that this was more than just another challenge. It was a direct attack on everything he'd worked for, a blatant attempt to derail his efforts to create meaningful change. As he sped through the rain-soaked streets, his mind raced with thoughts of betrayal and injustice. Who could have leaked the information? Was it someone within the system? Or was there a deeper corruption at play? The questions gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside, focusing instead on the resolve that had always driven him forward. Arriving at his office, he was met by a scene of chaos. His team was huddled around monitors, the room buzzing with tension and confusion. His assistant, Jenna, approached him first, her face pale but determined. Dr. Reid, we've lost control of the narrative. The leak is everywhere. News outlets are spinning it as you exploiting community resources for personal gain. Malcolm felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice steady. How did this happen? Who has access to these files? Jenna shook her head. We're still investigating, but it appears someone with high-level access compromised the security protocols. It's devastating, Malcolm. Your reputation is taking a hit. He took a deep breath, his internal strength surfacing amidst the turmoil. We need to counter this, with facts. Gather all the documentation on the clinic's funding and activities. We're going to hold a press conference tonight, address the leak head-on, and clarify the truth. As his team moved swiftly to comply, Malcolm felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him. He knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but his commitment to justice and equality remained unwavering. Later that evening, the conference room was set up with cameras and microphones, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Malcolm stood at the podium, the glow of the overhead lights casting shadows that mirrored the conflict within him. He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of his team and supporters, drawing strength from their presence. The moment the first reporter began to speak, Malcolm took a deep breath, his voice clear and resolute. Good evening, I'm Dr. Malcolm Reid, and I'm here to address the recent allegations and the leak concerning our free health clinic proposal. He laid out the facts calmly, presenting the transparent funding sources, the community support, and the extensive planning that had gone into the project. He addressed each false claim with evidence, his professionalism shining through the storm of misinformation. As he spoke, he could see the determination in his team's eyes, the unwavering belief in his mission, but he also sensed the undercurrents of doubt and skepticism among some in the audience, the lingering biases that continued to undermine his efforts. After his statement, a reporter raised her hand, her expression probing. Dr. Reid, some critics argue that your clinic could strain the hospital's resources and question your motivations. How do you respond to those concerns? Malcolm met her gaze, his resolve unshaken. Our clinic is designed to complement the hospital's services, not compete with them. We're addressing a critical gap in our community's healthcare needs. My motivation has always been, and will continue to be, the well-being of our patients and the betterment of our community. As questions continued, Malcolm navigated each one with grace and evidence, but the damage from the leak was palpable. The media frenzy was relentless, the narrative twisting and turning in ways that often seemed out of his control. After the press conference, as he left the building, the rain had intensified, the droplets cascading down his coat like a curtain of uncertainty. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls, the pressure mounting with every notification. Inside his car, he dialed Jenna's number. What's the latest? There's a video circulating online, showing confidential emails and internal communications that suggest you had ulterior motives. It's going viral, Malcolm. People are losing trust. Malcolm felt his blood boil, yet he remained composed. We need to verify the authenticity of this video and take legal action against the source. This is slander, and we won't stand for it. As he navigated through the turbulent streets, his mind raced with strategies and possibilities. The systemic challenges he faced were more insidious than ever, the prejudices and biases now openly challenging his integrity and mission. But Malcolm's resolve was unbreakable. He had faced adversity before, and he was determined to overcome it once more. However, as he approached his home, a flash of red and blue lights caught his attention. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. A police car was parked just yards from his driveway, officers milling about as reporters swarmed the area, eager for the next sensational headline. Malcolm pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight now marred by the intrusion of authority and media scrutiny. His phone buzzed again with an incoming call. This time, it was Lisa. "Malcolm, we've got another problem," she said urgently. "The authorities are claiming that your clinic's permits were obtained under false pretenses. They're detaining the key members of your team for questioning. It's escalating quickly." Malcolm felt a surge of helplessness but pushed it aside, focusing on the steps he needed to take. "I'll handle it. Keep gathering all the evidence and documentation we have. We need to fight this legally." Before he could respond further, a group of officers approached his car, their expressions stern. "Dr. Reid, you need to come with us. You're under arrest for fraud and misrepresentation related to the clinic's funding." Malcolm's mind raced, the internal struggle between anger and maintaining composure reaching its peak. He opened his door, stepping out with a calm exterior that belied the storm raging within him. "Do you have a warrant?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. "Yes, we do," Officer Burke replied, his tone clipped. "Please step out of the vehicle." As Malcolm walked toward the officers, his mind churned with questions and strategies. This was no longer just an attack on his professional integrity. It was a direct assault on his life's work and his mission to make a difference. He knew that standing up against this systemic corruption would require every ounce of his strength and resilience. Inside the courthouse, the once imposing structure now felt like a labyrinth of obstacles designed to trap him. As he was led through the halls by uniformed officers, Malcolm couldn't help but notice the snide remarks from some of the attendees, the unspoken judgments weighing heavily on him. In the interrogation room, the stark white walls and the harsh fluorescent lighting amplified the tension. Officer Burke sat across from him, his demeanor aggressive and unyielding. "Dr. Reid, we have substantial evidence that suggests you falsified documents to secure funding for your clinic," Burke stated, sliding a folder across the table. Malcolm opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. The documents appeared legitimate, meticulously detailed, but he knew better than to trust appearances alone. "These documents are genuine. Every dollar has been accounted for, and all funding sources are transparent. There's no fraud here." Burke leaned back, his gaze piercing. "We have testimonies from former associates who claim you manipulated the system to divert funds. These are serious allegations, Dr. Reid." Malcolm felt the familiar fire of injustice ignite within him, but he remained composed. "I've always operated with the utmost integrity. If there are misunderstandings or misinterpretations, I'm willing to clarify them. But these allegations are baseless and defamatory." As the hours dragged on, the interrogation continued, the officers relentless in their pursuit of a narrative that painted Malcolm as a manipulative fraudster, rather than the compassionate healer he truly was. Each question was designed to undermine his credibility, to strip away the layers of respect and trust he had built over years of dedicated service. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Lisa and a few of Malcolm's loyal colleagues were rallying support, organizing a peaceful protest to counteract the media's negative portrayal and to demand justice for Malcolm. Their voices, though small against the roaring media machines, carried the collective hope and determination of a community standing up against systemic injustice. As night fell, the courtroom drama reached a fever pitch. The judge prepared to adjourn, promising to reconvene the following week with a formal hearing. Malcolm was left to reflect on the relentless tide of prejudice and the uphill battle he now faced. Driving home in his court-ordered vehicle, Malcolm's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The systemic challenges he'd encountered were far more entrenched than he'd anticipated. The bias is not just personal, but institutional, making his fight not just about one man's integrity, but about dismantling the very structures that perpetuated discrimination. He glanced at the city lights blurred by the rain, a metaphor for his life. Brilliant and powerful, yet obscured by shadows of doubt and prejudice. As he approached his home, the weight of his situation pressed down on him. But so did a spark of determination. He knew that to protect his mission and his community, he would have to fight harder than ever before. Inside, Lisa was waiting, her expression a blend of worry and unwavering support. "We need to strategize," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. This isn't just about proving your innocence anymore. It's about exposing the systemic corruption that's targeting you. Malcolm nodded, feeling the resolve solidify within him. You're right. We need to gather more evidence, reach out to the media allies who believe in our cause, and ensure that the truth is heard. As they began to outline their plan, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like a rhythmic reminder of the storm they were navigating. Malcolm felt the urgency of the situation pressing on him, knowing that the next steps would determine not just his fate, but the future of the clinic and the community it served. But as they delved deeper into their strategy, the car's radio crackled to life with breaking news. The screen showed an image of Malcolm being led into the courthouse, surrounded by flashing lights and reporters. Breaking news. Prominent cardiac surgeon, Dr. Malcolm Reid, arrested on fraud charges. Community reacts as investigation continues. Malcolm felt a surge of helplessness, the realization that the battle was only just beginning sinking in. He looked at Lisa, her eyes reflecting the same mix of fear and determination that he felt. "We're in this together," she affirmed, her voice resolute. "We'll find a way to clear your name and bring the truth to light." Malcolm took a deep breath, the internal struggle between anger and maintaining his composure evident in his tense jaw and clenched fists. But beneath the surface, his resolve was unbreakable. He had faced adversity before, and he would face it again. This time, not just for himself, but for everyone who looked to him for hope and change. As the rain intensified, drumming against the windows and soaking the world outside, Malcolm felt a sense of anticipation building within him. The stakes were higher than ever, the conflict more personal and pervasive. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but he was ready to confront them head-on, driven by a steadfast commitment to justice and equality. The storm was raging, both outside and within, setting the stage for the decisive actions that would define his legacy and determine the future of his mission. The courtroom doors swung open, revealing a sea of expectant faces. Dr. Malcolm Reid stood motionless as the bailiff motioned him forward, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on his shoulders. Every step he took echoed his internal turmoil, the polished wooden floors reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. The judge's stern gaze met his as he approached the bench, the room filled with an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on him. "Dr. Reid, please take a seat," Judge Emerson instructed, her voice devoid of emotion. Malcolm complied, his mind racing with thoughts of his free clinic, his community, and the mounting evidence that suggested a deeper corruption at play. Across the aisle, Officer Burke watched him with thinly veiled disdain, his presence a constant reminder of the systemic biases Malcolm was up against. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Laura Bennett, approached the podium with a stack of documents in hand. "Your Honor, the prosecution is prepared to present evidence that clearly demonstrates Dr. Reid's fraudulent activities in securing funding for his so-called free health clinic." Malcolm felt a surge of frustration, but maintained his composure. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that his fight was far from over. As Bennett began her presentation, she meticulously outlined the supposed discrepancies in the funding sources, the exaggerated claims of community impact, and the testimonies of individuals who claimed they had been misled by Malcolm's promises. "But as we can see," Bennett continued, her voice steady and confident, "Dr. Reid's clinic has diverted essential funds from legitimate healthcare initiatives, causing significant strain on our already overburdened system." Malcolm listened intently, his mind working to dismantle each argument presented. When it was his turn to respond, he stood, the room's attention shifting solely to him. "Your Honor, these allegations are not only unfounded, but are a blatant attempt to undermine a program designed to serve our most vulnerable populations. The funding for my clinic comes exclusively from verified grants and donations from community members who genuinely believe in this mission." He held up a folder, his voice unwavering. "Here are the detailed accounts of every dollar spent, along with letters of support from local leaders and testimonials from those who have already benefited from our services. This clinic is a lifeline, not a financial burden." The judge nodded, allowing Malcolm to present his evidence. As he methodically went through each document, the room's atmosphere began to shift. Some members of the audience, including fellow doctors and community activists, watched with growing support, while others remained skeptical, influenced by the initial presentation of the prosecutor. Just as Malcolm felt a glimmer of hope, a commotion erupted near the back of the courtroom. A group of reporters and protesters had gathered outside, their chants and flashing cameras seeping into the proceedings. The media frenzy surrounding his case was intensifying, fueled by the recent leak and the ongoing campaign to tarnish his reputation. Judge Emerson raised her hand, silencing the room. Order? This is a court of law. We will not be distracted by external influences. Dr. Reid, please continue. Malcolm took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. He knew that the battle wasn't just in the courtroom, but also in the court of public opinion. Every word he spoke needed to reinforce his integrity and dedication to his community. As he concluded his defense, highlighting the tangible benefits of the clinic and the overwhelming support it had garnered, the tension in the room reached its peak. The judge prepared to deliver her verdict, the silence thick with anticipation. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, Judge Emerson began, her tone measured. It is clear that Dr. Malcolm Reid has operated within the bounds of legality and ethics in the establishment and management of the Cedar Grove Community Clinic. Therefore, the charges against him are hereby dismissed. A collective sigh of relief echoed through the courtroom. Malcolm allowed himself a moment to breathe, the weight of the ordeal lifting slightly. He nodded respectfully to the judge before returning to his seat, where Lisa Mitchell and a few supportive colleagues awaited him with reassuring smiles. As he exited the courtroom, the storm outside had broken, rain pouring down in heavy sheets. Washing away the remnants of the day's tension, Malcolm hailed a cab, his thoughts a whirlwind of strategies and next steps. The dismissal was a victory, but he knew that the true battle was just beginning. Back at his office, the atmosphere was electric, with a mix of relief and renewed determination. His legal team had already begun working on the counter-lawsuit against Marcus Chen, the former business partner, whose betrayal had set off the chain of events leading to Malcolm's downfall. Marcus had leveraged his influence and connections to sow doubt and manipulate perceptions, a tactic Malcolm was now determined to dismantle. Lisa entered the room, her face flushed from a long day of organizing support and coordinating with community leaders. Malcolm, we need to move fast. Marcus is doubling down, and the media is relentless. We have to expose the truth behind his actions. Malcolm nodded, his resolve hardening. We need concrete evidence of his misconduct, financial records, communication logs, anything that ties him directly to the sabotage of the clinic's funding. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Mitchell stepped in, her expression serious. I've got something you need to see. She handed him a USB drive, her hand slightly trembling. I found this in my office. It was hidden in one of the drawers after hours. It contains emails between Marcus and some key board members, discussing ways to undermine your projects. Malcolm took the USB, his mind racing with possibilities. This could be the breakthrough we need. Let's get it analyzed immediately. As they delved into the contents of the drive, the room filled with incriminating evidence, emails detailing strategic moves to redirect funds, internal memos about discrediting community programs, and plans to tarnish Malcolm's reputation were laid bare. It was a treasure trove of corruption, exposing the lengths Marcus and his allies would go to maintain their power and control. This is it, Lisa said, her voice filled with determination. This will expose everything we need to take this to the authorities and the media, now. Malcolm felt a surge of adrenaline. The tides were turning, but the opposition was still formidable. Marcus was a seasoned operator, adept at manipulating systems to his advantage. We need to ensure that this information reaches the right people without getting lost in the chaos. Let's coordinate with trusted journalists and legal experts who can handle this delicately. As they strategized, the urgency of their mission became palpable. The systemic corruption they were up against was deeply entrenched, but the newfound evidence gave them a fighting chance. Malcolm's internal strength, honed through years of facing bias and overcoming obstacles, was now their greatest asset. Later that evening, Malcolm stood before a group of community leaders and supporters at a local town hall meeting. The room was filled with passionate individuals who had come to rally behind him, their faces a blend of hope and determination. As he addressed the crowd, his voice resonated with the same calm authority that had guided him through countless surgeries and personal battles. Thank you all for coming, he began, his eyes sweeping across the room. Today, we stand at a pivotal moment. The evidence we've uncovered reveals a pattern of corruption and manipulation that threatens not only our clinic, but the very foundation of our community's trust." The audience erupted in applause, their support fueling his resolve. But we are not alone in this fight. With the truth on our side, and the support of this incredible community, we can hold those responsible accountable and ensure that justice prevails. As he concluded his speech, the sense of anticipation was electric. The moment had come to take decisive action against the systemic injustices that had plagued him and his mission. The community's backing provided a crucial pillar of strength, but Malcolm knew that the true test lay ahead. Returning to his office, Malcolm found Lisa and Mitchell already deep in discussion, the USB drive placed prominently on the table between them. "We need to launch a public campaign," Lisa said, her eyes alight with purpose. "Social media, local news outlets, everything we have, the public needs to know the truth." Malcolm agreed, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "And we need legal support to protect ourselves from any further attacks. Marcus and his allies won't stop until they've silenced us." As the team mobilized, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the horizon, symbolizing the beginning of their fight against the entrenched corruption. Malcolm took a moment to look out the window, the city awakening beneath him, a beacon of hope amidst the impending storm. But as the team prepared their next moves, an unexpected visitor arrived at Malcolm's door. A high-ranking official from the Department of Justice, accompanied by a stern-faced Officer Daniels, another symbol of the systemic biases Malcolm had been battling. "Dr. Reid," the official greeted, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "We need to discuss your recent activities and the evidence you've uncovered. Please come with us." Malcolm felt a chill run down his spine, the stakes escalating to unprecedented heights. He exchanged a brief, resolute glance with his team, knowing that this confrontation could either be the final nail in the coffin or the turning point they desperately needed. As he followed the officials out of the office, the weight of the moment pressed upon him. The journey he had embarked upon, driven by a desire to serve and uplift his community, had now transformed into a battle against an invisible enemy entrenched within the very systems meant to protect and serve. The night was still young, but Malcolm's resolve burned brighter than ever. He was ready to confront the corruption head-on, to fight for justice not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated or oppressed. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but Malcolm knew that true change required unwavering courage and unyielding determination. As the officials led him away, the rain had ceased, leaving the streets glistening under the first light of dawn. Malcolm took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs. This was the moment that would define his legacy, a test of his strength and resilience against the odds stacked against him. The battle for justice had reached its peak, and Dr. Malcolm Reid was prepared to fight until the very end. The courthouse's grand facade loomed ominously in the early morning light, its marble steps slick with lingering rain. Dr. Malcolm Reid sat in the back seat of the court-ordered vehicle, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and strategies. Beside him, Lisa Mitchell reviewed the USB drive's contents one last time, her eyes sharp with determination. The car pulled up to the imposing entrance, and Malcolm took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had faced countless challenges in his career, but this confrontation felt different, more personal, more insidious. The officers guided him through the bustling courthouse lobby, the air thick with tension and the scent of polished wood and stale coffee. As Malcolm was led into the interrogation room, he caught sight of Officer Daniels, a high-ranking official known for his ruthless enforcement of dubious policies. Daniels's presence was a stark reminder of the systemic biases that Malcolm had been battling. His reputation for being uncompromising and often unfair made him a formidable antagonist. The room was stark and cold, with a single table and 2 chairs. A metal strip separated Malcolm from Daniels, the barrier symbolizing the invisible walls built by prejudice and power. Malcolm sat down, his posture relaxed, but his mind alert, ready to navigate the verbal sparring that was sure to follow. "Dr. Reid," Daniels began, his voice smooth but edged with contempt. "We need to discuss the allegations against you regarding the clinic's funding. There are discrepancies that need to be addressed." Malcolm nodded, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm aware of the concerns, Officer Daniels. I've provided all necessary documentation to the board, and I stand by the integrity of the clinic's funding sources. Daniels leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Documents can be manipulated, Dr. Reid. We have reason to believe there's more to your financial dealings than what you've presented. Malcolm felt a surge of frustration, but kept his voice steady. If there are specific concerns or evidence, I'm more than willing to address them. Transparency is key in my operations. Daniels tapped a folder on the table, sliding it across the metal strip. This contains internal communications between you and Marcus Chen, conversations that suggest a motive to sabotage your clinic's funding for personal gain. Malcolm glanced at the folder, recognizing the name immediately. Marcus Chen had been his trusted business partner until betrayal had severed their ties. Marcus and I had our differences, but I never compromised the integrity of the clinic's mission. Any communication between us was purely professional. Daniel smirked, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. Yet, these emails indicate a calculated effort to redirect funds and discredit your efforts. How do you explain that? Malcolm's internal strength surged, fueled by years of resilience. Marcus had his own agenda, one that didn't align with the clinic's goals. I separated from him because I couldn't stand by his unethical practices. Any attempts to undermine the clinic were his alone. Daniel's expression hardened. We're looking into potential ties between Marcus and certain board members who may have influenced your decisions. There's a network here that's much bigger than just you and Marcus. Malcolm felt the weight of systemic corruption pressing down on him, but his resolve remained unshaken. If there's corruption within the board, it needs to be exposed and dealt with appropriately. I've been fighting against these biases and manipulations to ensure that the clinic serves its purpose without interference. Daniels leaned back, crossing his arms. We'll see, Dr. Reid. For now, you're to remain under surveillance until this investigation concludes. As Malcolm was escorted out of the room, his mind raced. The confrontation had only deepened the mystery surrounding Marcus Chen and the systemic corruption within the board. He knew that taking a stand required more than just evidence. It required uncovering the tangled web of deceit that Marcus had woven. Back at his office, Malcolm convened an emergency meeting with his team. Lisa, Mitchell, Jenna, and a few trusted allies gathered around the conference table, the atmosphere charged with urgency. We need to expose the extent of Marcus Chen's corruption, Malcolm began, his voice firm. He's not just trying to undermine the clinic, he's manipulating the entire system to maintain his power and influence. We have to dig deeper. Lisa nodded, her eyes steely with determination. I've been cross-referencing our financial records with public data. There are several irregularities that could link Marcus to illicit activities. We just need to connect the dots. Mitchell added, I've reached out to some former associates of Marcus. A few are willing to talk, but they're afraid for their safety. We need to ensure their protection while we gather more information. Jenna interjected, Our media allies are ready to help. Once we have solid evidence, we can work with them to expose Marcus, and the corruption within the board. Public pressure might be the key to turning things around. Malcolm felt a surge of hope. Despite the mounting challenges, his team was unified and ready to fight alongside him. Good. We need to move quickly and discreetly. Every piece of evidence we uncover strengthens our case and brings us closer to justice. As the team dispersed to their tasks, Malcolm took a moment to reflect. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but his commitment to his mission and his community remained steadfast. He knew that the battle against systemic corruption required unwavering courage and strategic thinking. Later that evening, Malcolm received a call from an anonymous tipster. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. I have information about Marcus Chen that you need to hear. His heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and caution. He relayed the details to Lisa, who insisted on accompanying him for safety. Together, they navigated the dimly lit streets, the shadows playing tricks on their minds as they approached the abandoned warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the lingering scent of rust. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a narrow beam that illuminated a figure standing in the center of the room. It was Marcus Chen, his expression a mask of smug confidence. Dr. Reid, Marcus greeted, his voice smooth and taunting. I wasn't expecting to see you here so soon. Malcolm took a deep breath, his internal strength guiding his actions. Cut the crap, Marcus. What are you doing here? Marcus chuckled, stepping closer. Always so serious, I thought we could have a little chat, clear the air. After all, we used to be partners. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. You sabotaged my clinic, Marcus. You manipulated the board and spread false information to ruin my reputation. Why? Marcus shrugged nonchalantly. It was a business decision, Malcolm. The clinic was a distraction, a misallocation of resources. You could have made far more money focusing on your own interests, but you were too blinded by your so-called altruism. Malcolm felt a surge of anger, but remained composed. You twisted facts and exploited your position to undermine something that could have genuinely helped people. This isn't about money, Marcus. It's about integrity and community. Marcus stepped closer, his demeanor shifting to one of mockery. Integrity, community. Please, Malcolm. You're a surgeon, not a philanthropist. People look up to you because you save lives, not because you think you're better than everyone else. Malcolm's patience wore thin. You're the one who thinks you're better, using your influence to control and manipulate for your gain. You've become everything I've been fighting against. Marcus smirked, circling Malcolm like a predator eyeing its prey. Oh, come on. You really think you're making a difference? Your clinic is a drop in the ocean. Meanwhile, I'm running an empire. Malcolm's resolve solidified, his internal strength manifesting in his unwavering stance. It's not about the scale, it's about the impact. You might have an empire, but it's built on manipulation and greed. I'd rather have a small clinic that saves lives than an empire that destroys them. Before Marcus could retort, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse as several armed men entered the room, surrounding Malcolm and Lisa. Their leader, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. Looks like we have company, he growled. Time to end this, Malcolm. Malcolm felt a surge of adrenaline, his mind racing to assess the situation. He glanced at Lisa, who gave him a subtle nod, her own resolve unwavering. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were not without their own resources. From the shadows, the sound of sirens wailed, growing louder with each passing second. The warehouse door burst open, and a squad of police officers stormed in, led by Officer Daniels and Lisa's friend from the hospital, Detective Ramirez. The armed men turned towards the new arrivals, their eyes flicking between Malcolm and the officers. Daniels stepped forward, his demeanor no longer just authoritative but defiant. Enough, Marcus. It's over. Marcus snarled, raising his hands in mock surrender. You think you can just walk in and stop me? This is bigger than you. Detective Ramirez approached, her badge gleaming in the dim light. Not anymore. We have evidence of your corruption and illegal activities, Marcus. You're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice. As the officers moved in to apprehend Marcus and his men, Malcolm felt a sense of vindication. The confrontation had reached its peak, the systemic corruption exposed, and the antagonist unmasked for who he truly was, a man driven by greed and power, willing to destroy anything in his path. But the victory was bittersweet. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his eyes met Malcolm's, filled with a mixture of anger and respect. This isn't the end, Dr. Reid. There are others like me. You've only scratched the surface. Malcolm nodded, his resolve unwavering. We'll see about that. Justice has a way of prevailing. As the dust settled and the sirens faded into the distance, Malcolm turned to Lisa, her face reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and relief. We did it, she whispered. He smiled, though fatigue weighed heavily on him. Yes, but the fight isn't over. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting against the corruption that threatens our community. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness as the backup generators failed, the only light coming from the flashing lights of approaching emergency vehicles. The armed men, realizing the tides had turned against them, drew their weapons and prepared to retaliate. Malcolm's instincts kicked in, his surgical precision now redirected towards survival and protection. He moved swiftly, his actions calculated and deliberate, guiding Lisa and the officers to safety. The tension in the room surged, the imminent threat of violence palpable. In the midst of the chaos, Malcolm locked eyes with Officer Daniels, their shared history and mutual respect evident despite the circumstances. We need to secure the perimeter, he ordered, his voice steady. Don't let them take anyone else. Daniels nodded, moving to coordinate the officers. While Detective Ramirez took charge of neutralizing the remaining threats, Malcolm and Lisa worked together seamlessly, their combined strengths a testament to their unwavering commitment to justice. As the situation spiraled, a single, desperate bullet shattered the stillness, striking the wall nearby and sending debris flying. The room erupted into a cacophony of gunfire and shouts, the reality of the confrontation sinking in. Malcolm ducked behind a sturdy pillar, his heart pounding, his mind focused on the immediate threat. He could hear Lisa calling out to coordinate the defense, her voice a beacon of strength amidst the turmoil. He knew that every second counted, that the decisions made in these moments would shape the outcome of their fight. In the heat of the moment, a revelation struck him. This wasn't just about Marcus or the corruption within the board, it was about the broader system that allowed individuals like Marcus to thrive while others, despite their integrity and dedication, were targeted and undermined. With newfound clarity, Malcolm realized that to truly combat the injustice they faced, they needed to dismantle the structures that perpetuated it. The fight was no longer just about exposing Marcus, but about challenging the systemic biases that had created a culture of corruption and discrimination. As the last of the armed men were apprehended, and the emergency lights cast a stark glow over the scene, Malcolm stood tall, his chest heaving with exertion and emotion. The confrontation had reached its climax, the stakes higher than ever, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He glanced at Lisa, who nodded with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "What's next?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Malcolm took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "We go public with everything, expose the corruption, the systemic biases, and the lengths they went to undermine us. It's time for real change." As they stepped out of the warehouse into the now clear night, the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, a symbol of hope amidst the darkness. Malcolm knew that the journey ahead was fraught with challenges, but his resolve was unbreakable. The battle for justice was far from over, and he was ready to lead the charge. But as they walked away, a shadowy figure watched from the rooftop, their eyes fixed on Malcolm and Lisa. The confrontation had exposed deeper layers of corruption, and the true mastermind behind the scheme was still at large. The final showdown was yet to come, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead hung in the air like a heavy fog, setting the stage for the decisive actions that would determine the fate of Malcolm's mission and his fight against systemic injustice. As Malcolm and Lisa continued their march towards a new dawn, the shadowy figure on the rooftop pulled out a phone, their expression cold and calculating. "It's not over yet," they whispered into the device, the implications of their words echoing ominously into the night.